A very quick introduction of our three speakers. First, we have Barbara Bodine, who is at the Woodrow Wilson School. She's a lecturer here. She runs our SINCI program, our Scholars in the Nation Service Initiative, and she's the former ambassador to Yemen, so very well qualified to speak on this issue. Our second speaker will be Michael Ryan, who is he's a senior research associate at the Jamestown Foundation. And to wrap everything up is Jacob Shapiro, who's a Woodrow Wilson School assistant professor of politics and international affairs. So I'm going to keep the introduction short and let the talk begin. Thank you.
Thank you all for coming. Yes, this was an event that we planned long before we knew. It just shows how prescient the people at Princeton are, that the rest of the world missed what was going to be happening, but Princeton knew. And I'll get to how we came up with the title, but I came across a quote today in something else I was reading that I think really does encapsulate what's going on. And it said that sometimes decades pass and nothing happens, and then sometimes weeks pass and decades happen. And that seems to be what that we're going through in the Middle East right now. I think another kind of conventional wisdom that is appropriate is that authoritarian regimes, while they rule, their collapse seems to be inconceivable, and then after they have fallen, their demise seems to be inevitable. Anyone who has not been in a cave for the last 2 months or so, and you wouldn't be here, cave for the last 2 months, knows that there's been a wave of demonstrations, protest movements, and revolutions across the Middle East. If anyone had asked either the most pessimistic or the most optimistic observers of the region on January 1st, that if by March 1st, Ben Ali of Tunisia, Mubarak of Egypt, two of the most repressive leaders in the region, would be gone and Gaddafi would be under siege, I don't think anyone would have taken your bet. Having missed the third wave of democratization, the region seems to recently have just been hit with a tsunami, the full implications of which we're going to have to wait some time to see. Tunisia was spontaneous. The rest have been planned and organized. They are not leaderless, and if anything, suffer from too many leaders, too many interests, a lack of long-term agenda or consistent goals, except perhaps in Tunisia, Egypt, and Libya, where the removal of the leader and the leadership is a core and irreducible objective. In virtually every other instance, the protesters range from reform to regime change, with various intermediate stops along the regime adaptation continuum. The wave has some significant common threads and some significant national distinctions. The common threads are a significant youth bulge. Upwards of 50% of the populations in this region are under 25, in some places under 20. And in Yemen, 50% of the population is under the age of 15. They have little connection to the world of their parents. They have been raised on satellite TV, which has created a transnational consciousness that doesn't replace their own nationalism or their own identity, but does provide a sense of shared experience, shared frustrations, and shared aspirations. They feel both empowered and marginalized. The new social media of Facebook, Twitter, and all of that has amplified this, but it didn't create it. In varying degrees, they've been raised on promises of democratization, reform, and liberalization, in some places partially realized and in others not at all. Another common thing or common thread is rampant unemployment, underemployment, and a disconnect between education such as it is provided and the skills that their economies need. Both politically and economically, there were promises made to this youth, and promises that were not kept. The leadership in many cases has been in power for decades. With exception, there is almost a direct correlation between the time in office and the strength of the protests. To describe this as just a generational issue is overly simplistic, but there is, I think, a very important clash of generations going on. In terms of national differences, each protest movement has clearly specified local agenda. It may be jobs, it may be the expansion of political space, but in terms of how they want those political or economic changes done, each is very specific. Much of the difference on the ground reflects the degree to which a particular government and that political space was open, adaptable, and responsive to either reform or did it demand revolution. Each is responding to its own set of grievances within a very specific political structure. Pundits early on in this process began to bray that the U.S. government was caught by surprise. And to a certain extent it was, as was everyone. Most importantly, I think, many of the protesters. The repressive, ossified nature of many of these regimes, however, was not a surprise. In many of these countries, including Egypt, there have been similar demonstrations in the past, although not as successful. Some, including the 2006 demonstrations in Kuwait and the protests in Lebanon, were successful. In the former, they brought about major political reforms, and in the latter, it forced the Syrians out of Lebanon. Some were responding to local political calendars. In Bahrain, there is a lingering resentment over the recent elections, and in Yemen, a lot of this is driven by the elections that were to take place in April. And all of these have a shared experience via the new media. I had the opportunity to visit Yemen this January. The Tunisian demonstrations were ongoing, but Ben Ali had not yet fled, and the Cairo demonstrations had not yet begun. Yet there was a very distinct sense of an impending crisis, much like that smell of rain that you have before a thunderstorm even appears on the horizon. Virtually everyone I spoke with mentioned the grinding problem of unemployment. There is a job deficit in Yemen of somewhere around 5 million out of a population of 25 million. With very few resources, little revenue in the government to support education, inadequate infrastructure, there really is no ready solution to this problem. We can't create 5 million jobs here. To expect the Yemen government to be able to create it in a short period of time is unrealistic. The second set of storm clouds that were clearly rumbling as I was there was the political crisis. The opposition had already gained a constitutional crisis and political paralysis, and young activists that I met with were very openly planning demonstrations, protests, march, and the demise of Ali Abdullah Saleh. The U.S. government was concerned and aware, but it was not overly engaged for a number of reasons. One primary reason, and it speaks to an extent to the rest of the region, but most significantly to Yemen, has been a near obsession with Al-Qaeda in the Arabian Peninsula in this particular case, terrorism and security, and a resulting security-centric policy and series of programs over the past several years. In an earlier visit to Yemen, a couple of years ago, I heard from a number of contacts, both in the government and outside the government, civil society, a frustration with this security-centric approach. They were not unaware or unconcerned of the threats posed by Al-Qaeda, AQAP, Al-Qaeda in the Arabian Peninsula, for you don't know, AQAP. They were not uncooperative, nor were they unabashed about their lack of capacity and their need for assistance, training, and equipment. Their point was that our focus on the immediate and, yes, the urgent threat of AQAP distracted us and them from dealing with the longer-term core structural threats to the stability and survival of the state. Not necessarily the regime or the government, but the state and the country. Their plea was not that we change focus, but that we open up the aperture, our policy, our programs, and our assistance to work on the fundamentals, on education, service delivery, governance, job creation, and the like. What they were asking for was an equitable, if not an equal, at least an equitable commitment of time, money, and political capital that we seem to invest in our efforts to deter, disrupt, and dismantle AQAP. In other words, they wanted us to think outside the AQAP box and to deal with the why of the instability and problems in Yemen, and not just this narrow group of who. In the last few years, there have been some efforts and some words to indicate a greater appreciation of this whole of problem approach. Last December, John Brennan, who's the National Security Advisor on Counterterrorism and has been the de facto desk officer on Yemen, gave a speech at the Carnegie Endowment where he said, for the first time that I know of, he discussed the need to address the fundamental challenges in Yemen and not just the immediate threats. And Secretary Clinton delivered essentially the same message when she was there in January. Whether or not Ali Abdullah Saleh is able to craft an agreement with the opposition for an orderly transition, or if there is going to be a more dramatic change of government, Yemen and the U.S. are going to still be faced with the same challenges, the same problems, and the same threats to stability and survival in the country. If we do not, in the face of the overwhelming evidence that the real threats to the country and the states, the real concerns and the real needs of the people of Yemen, and thus our real security imperatives, get outside the AQAP box, then the central concern that the political instability could, if only because the current government is distracted or a new government will take time to establish its authority and get itself organized, if we do not take this opportunity to start addressing the real issues in Yemen, then we are going to continue to be faced with an AQAP threat, which will take advantage of the vacuum, take advantage of the space created, and continue to be the kind of threat that we worry about. But we need to look longer term, broader, outside the box, and to the long-term interest in what has driven both AQAP's ability to operate there and what has driven the protests, the demonstrations currently going on. With that, I'm going to turn it over to Mike, then to my colleague, and then we will open it up for your questions, comments, challenges, and arguments. Michael?
Please let me know if I can be heard.
You can.
I can? Great, thank you. Well, my name is Michael Ryan, and let me just tell you one thing. I've been spending the last year and a half under a grant to read everything I could about Al-Qaeda in Arabic and to write a book about their strategy. So I'm going to be looking a lot inside the box, but I think I'm going to find a way to get outside the box by the time I'm finished. So I'm going to talk mainly today about how Yemen is related to Al-Qaeda's strategy, and whether the upgoing upheavals across the Arab world present Al-Qaeda with opportunities in Yemen. I'm basing my comments today mainly on the works of two prominent authors of Al-Qaeda strategy. Both men were close associates with Al-Qaeda's leadership, reflect their thinking, and are well known to the leadership of Al-Qaeda in the Arabian Peninsula, AQAP. And both of them are out of action right now. I will focus on four basic questions. The first question is, what is Al-Qaeda's historical relationship to Yemen? The first author, Abu Musab al-Suri, presents the origins of Al-Qaeda's interest in operations in Yemen. And I'm going to quote here, so when you hear me talking about supporting Al-Qaeda, it's really al-Suri, it's not me, regardless of how they cut this tape up. The quote, Osama bin Laden's personal and principled jihadist plan, was to have a jihadist movement in South Yemen. He began working on this plan in 1989 and kept working on it until unification took place. Although many of the mujahideen who were then close to bin Laden, including myself, al-Suri, had encouraged him to carry out this plan immediately, he still hesitated to do so. Bin Laden wanted to convince the leadership of the Islamic revival in Yemen, and especially the organization of the Muslim Brotherhood, such as Sheikh Abdel Majid al-Zindani, who was a prominent leader at the time, to participate in jihadist movement. However, these individuals did not want to be involved, and in my opinion, a great chance for this movement was lost. So although Al-Qaeda did not move its headquarters to Yemen, it was able to insert members, and it was able to accomplish a number of dramatic attacks against Western interests there. Notably, from the U.S. point of view, the spectacular attack against the USS Cole back in 2000, and we're all familiar with the ones more recently, which I won't go over. In Assuri's study concerning the obligation of the people to engage in Yemen, he concluded that the religious leaders of Yemen were more interested in normal lives and the advantages the government had to offer than in Al-Qaeda. After the unification of Yemen, which was 1990, bin Laden tried again to gain a foothold in Yemen, and again I'm going to quote from Assuri. Bin Laden tried to negotiate with the greatest of the sheikhs of Yemen, its Salafist scholars, the Muslim Brotherhood and its leadership, and so forth. He invested large sums of money in the aim of swaying them and some of the tribes to his plan. Sadly, all of them let bin Laden down, and instead they all followed Sheikh Ali Abdullah Saleh, who offered them official positions of power, resources, riches, and different types of help in their personal matters, end quote. In other words, Yemen's tribes and religious leaders were not interested in Al-Qaeda at all, although they took his money. So let me turn to question number 2. Why did Al-Qaeda intensify its efforts in Yemen over the last several years? If bin Laden had a detailed plan of his own for Yemen as early as 1989 that he did not put into action because he could not get the cooperation of local Salafist leaders, what changed in 2009? I argue the change is mostly with Al-Qaeda. First of all, there was the 2006 prison break that allowed a number of Al-Qaeda operatives who had been in Guantanamo and had been in various places, including Iran, a number of places, back into the public. But the most important reason was that Al-Qaeda activities are a sign of desperation. They're a gamble, the outcome of which depends more on what the United States does than anything Al-Qaeda in the Arabian Peninsula can do. Al-Qaeda's leadership is desperate because of the tremendous losses suffered since 9/11 on all fronts. Al-Qaeda needs a new front. Yemen was that front, and Al-Qaeda has a strategy, a model for jihad in Yemen, based on a deep study of Mao, the Cuban Revolution, and the Vietnam War, as well as lessons learned from its own mistakes. And perhaps most importantly, when all is said and done, Osama bin Laden is really mostly interested in the Arabian Peninsula. He had a full-scale insurrection launched in Saudi Arabia in 2003 when Al-Qaeda had what they called a jihad there. It was an insurrection. The Saudis were able to destroy this attempt mostly in about 18 months. And many of bin Laden's operators had advised him that it was too early to start an insurrection in Saudi Arabia, in great part because the existing networks inside the kingdom had not established proper logistical arrangements in Yemen. In fact, President Saleh mostly destroyed a separate Al-Qaeda organization in Yemen by 2004. Al-Qaeda always considers defeat temporary, so that by 2009, with new plans, a new Al-Qaeda organization was ready to try again, this time consolidated in Yemen, which fits their strategic model much better. And it's amazing how closely it fits their model. I'm going to turn to the second author, whose name is Abu Bakr Naji, who had a strategic model that he wanted to apply, that AQAP wants to apply to Yemen. Naji's book, The Administration of Savagery, presents a three-phase model for establishing an Al-Qaeda-style government in conditions that match Yemen's situation very closely. This strategy self-consciously mimics the classic guerrilla strategy of Mao Zedong, and even more Che Guevara and Regis Debray, who he was able to, I mean, it's out of print. I had to get it out of print to read what Regis had to say, but they're reading it, or they did back 5 years ago. So the first phase of this stage is terrorism operations and insurgent attacks to weaken the local government. But in Al-Qaeda's case, most of all, to go to the United States, to leap over local forces, to engage the mujahideen and the local people directly. This is very explicit. This is kind of my interpretation. These operations can be used to counter what he terms America's deceptive media halo that portrays us in a favorable light. Once American combat troops are engaged, Al-Qaeda can use that brute fact to promote again the narrative that the United States is pursuing a war against Islam rather than following the democratic principles for which we stand. The intention is to increase Al-Qaeda's credibility, increase the cost to the United States, and draw more recruits and funding to the local jihad. So where do Yemenis now stand on Al-Qaeda? The much-recorded declaration of Yemen's religious leaders back in January 14th of 2009 that they would call for jihad if any foreign military intervenes in Yemen tells us two very different things. One is that Al-Qaeda's assumption about the potential effect of American military intervention are correct in the case of Yemen. And two, Yemen's religious leaders have not supported jihad against the United States in Yemen and are not fully in Al-Qaeda's camp by any means. Obviously, Al-Qaeda has some support among a few tribes, but to achieve what it calls jihad in Yemen, Al-Qaeda needs the United States to act. In the second phase in Naji's model, Al-Qaeda sets up a phantom quasi-government that provides basic services to the people, and we can see examples of this under Taliban control in Afghanistan. In Yemen, the target might be the South, whose secession Al-Qaeda supports. The model's last phase involves the establishment of a full Al-Qaeda-style government locally and then expansion to a next priority area. But is Al-Qaeda in the Arabian Peninsula still following the strategy described by Naji, even after previous defeats? The simple answer is yes. We can find recent written evidence along with what we can tell from the operation inside Yemen and those projected outward at America and our allies. The head of Al-Qaeda in the Arabian Peninsula in March 2010, the leader of the AQAP, personally endorsed and published online a posthumous book written by a man who was killed in an airstrike in Shabwa province. The book is entitled Why I Chose Al-Qaeda, لماذا اخترعت Al-Qaeda, in Arabic, hasn't been translated, with each chapter giving a reason. And the reason, one of the reasons, is the excellence of Al-Qaeda's strategy as interpreted by Naji, who's quoted verbatim and cited by page number, including the three-stage guerrilla strategy and overarching purpose of forcing America to engage Muslim communities directly. The book is AQAP's endorsement of Naji's insurgency model for Yemen. The attacks and attempted attacks on the U.S. and Europe from Yemen are intended to weaken the West's resolve and take the pressure off the leadership in Southwest Asia. The idea is also to dilute the United States' focus, raise the cost of operating in Al-Qaeda's priority areas. What better way is there to take pressure off the leadership in Southwest Asia than to distract the United States with crisis focused on the economically crucial Arabian Peninsula, with terrorist attacks reaching to America itself? So far, Al-Qaeda in the Arabian Peninsula is stuck in the first stage described in the administration of savagery, the stage of terrorist attacks aimed at goading and exhausting both the United States and Saudi Arabia, and ultimately weakening or destroying the government of Yemen. It has not been successful, and it's been overtaken by events, frankly. So let me turn to the fourth question: what should be the United States' response? Well, the unrest in Yemen, I think, began after Tunisia and Egypt's rebellions, and it continues today, but Al-Qaeda had very little, or I would say nothing, to do with it. But unlike Egypt and Tunisia, Al-Qaeda is in place in Yemen and will try to take advantage of circumstances. Will they be successful? I doubt it. I really doubt it. As long as America refuses to play their game by refusing to deploy combat troops, no matter the provocation, and give technical assistance instead. In short, if we refuse to play their game, they don't win. To frustrate Al-Qaeda's strategy, we should continue to encourage President Saleh, or whatever government replaces him, to work against Al-Qaeda locally, of course. But we should not hesitate to counsel him against human rights abuses, and encouraging real political forms and economic progress are also critical, although much more difficult than killing Al-Qaeda operatives. If Al-Qaeda in the Arabian Peninsula is to mount a direct successful attack against the United States from Yemen, we should respond by maintaining our focus on attacks on the leadership layers in Southwest Asia and avoid direct operations in Yemen. I do not underestimate the political difficulty for any administration would have resisting the pressure for a strong local response of Al-Qaeda in the Arabian Peninsula managed to orchestrate a successful attack inside the United States itself. Nevertheless, assistance to Yemen, direct attacks against the leadership in Southwest Asia is the most likely route to frustrate Al-Qaeda's plans. And economic assistance and political reform assistance that we do extremely well should be the emphasis that we have. Of course, if a full-blown civil war develops, everything without exception gets much more difficult. But it should not alter our resolve not to intervene. Thank you.
So I'm going to try and make a contribution here, since I'm neither a Yemen specialist nor a specialist in protests and revolutions. I'm going to really try and contribute a couple things to the debate here that play a little more to the things that I know something about. And so I'll talk a little bit about the scope of the problems of terrorism in Yemen, and try and just give a way to kind of bound how bad the security problem is there in ways that might make it sensible, and let us think about, are the levels of violence that we've observed there before the recent political unrest, are they consistent with long-term political stability? And then I want to talk a little bit, try and give a little bit of historical perspective on three counts. The first is the historical value of chaotic spaces for terrorist groups, which is important for thinking about what's the threat in Yemen if there is chaos there. Second, make a note of caution about interpreting long-term trends when you have regions under revolution. And then third, talk a little bit about, in response to Michael's fascinating comments, a little bit about a note of caution on reading kind of military strategies. And maybe hopefully that'll provoke a bit of a debate between us, which should be entertaining for you, although as maybe not being a good host. So let me talk about the scope of the problem a little bit. So I took a look this afternoon at some of the data from a couple different sources on terrorism in Yemen. And there are basically two sources for data in terrorism in these places. And I chose to use the National Counterterrorism Center's Worldwide Incident Tracking System, which is really the most reliable source of data. So from January 1, 2004, when these data start, through, let's see, the end of September 2010, which is the most recent they have there, there were 257 terrorist attacks in Yemen. 43 of those involved Al-Qaeda or Al-Qaeda in the Arabian Peninsula. So it's about 17%. And there were 312 people killed. And that's about 87 of those were in the attacks by Al-Qaeda and its affiliates. So that's about 28% of the Yemenis who died as a consequence of terrorism. So Yemen has 25 million people. So how bad is this as a problem? Well, let's think about Pakistan. So that's a country that many people are more familiar with. It's been more prevalent in the news. So in Pakistan, there were about 1,800 terrorist attacks over the same period. So that's about 7.5 times more than in Yemen. But the population of Pakistan is 160 million people. So if the level of the problem is the same, there should be 7 times as many attacks in Pakistan, which is what we see. However, in Pakistan, 7,848 people died in terrorist attacks during the same period, which is 3.5 times worse per capita than what's going on in Yemen. Now, if you take the perspective that I do, that the terrorism in Pakistan is in no way a threat to that country's long-term stability, right? It's actually minor compared to lots of other forms of political violence that are prevalent in that country. Then you start to get maybe a little bit less worried about the levels of violence in Yemen. They may in fact be consistent with long-term stability. Okay, so now a few words on historical perspective. So the first thing is just to think about the history of Al-Qaeda in operating in ungoverned spaces. Now, for most groups, for most terrorist groups, ungoverned spaces have historically not been great places to operate. And we actually have fantastic evidence of this for Al-Qaeda in Somalia in the 1990s. So most of the internal documents that people in Al-Qaeda were writing about their experiences in the 1990s made it into U.S. government databases after the war in Afghanistan. And I've spent some time working with those. And the documents, especially from the initial set of teams that Al-Qaeda sent into Somalia to evaluate the situation there in 93 and 94 and early 95, basically came back and said, this is a terrible place for us to establish bases and training camps. It's just awful. The food is terrible. It's hard to get in and out. The locals rip us off. And everything's for sale, including information on us, and so it's really dangerous. And so what Al-Qaeda in his experience in Somalia in the 1990s would suggest is that what's valuable for terrorist groups is not ungoverned space. That's a disaster for them just as it is for anyone who's not a local power broker. Right? What's valuable for them is space that's governed by someone who will tolerate their presence, And I don't know enough about the tribal dynamics of Yemen to know if there are places where that would be the case within Yemen. But that's the question I think we need to be asking, is are there people who would emerge from those local power structures that would support the groups that are of concern for us? And if there are, then having a coherent national government is a security issue, at least from the perspective of worrying about Al-Qaeda. If not, it may not be such an issue. Okay, the second point is a note of caution about interpreting long-term trends. And so we've seen this wave of movements across the Middle East since January 1st that Ambassador Bodine wonderfully summarized. And so let's think about the last wave of such movements that swept across the world, and this was the color revolutions in Eastern Europe a few years back. And this was a moment of great historical hope, right? We had all these wonderful nonviolent revolutions taking place, citizen power and everything. But in a number of those countries, it's largely led to disappointment, right? You've had the gradual return of the same old nomenclature in a lot of them, and the return to high levels of corruption. So that looked great at the time, and in retrospect, it's been a bit of a moment, a disappointment. We can think back to the wave before that, which was the wave of political and ethnic conflict that followed the fall of the USSR in 1991. And looking forward from 1992 or 1993 and saying what's going to happen in the Caucasus and what's going to happen in Eastern Europe, the view would have been incredibly bleak, right? We were clearly headed for the wars of Yugoslav succession. The situation in Georgia and Armenia and Azerbaijan looked just terrible. Looking back, though, now, with the exception of Chechnya, that moment of despair has led to a number of countries that have done really, really well in the last 10 years. And so it's just a note of caution to say, as we hear people making what can at best be educated guesses about how this will all play out, let's keep in mind that the last time people were doing that, mostly we didn't do such a good job of predicting, just because it's just really hard. And then the last thing I want to just touch on is to talk a little bit about what we should take away, what the implications are that we should draw from Al-Qaeda's military strategy, particularly Al-Qaeda and their Arabian Peninsula strategy. And the thing I want to highlight is that military strategy, as expressed by leaders who seem very thoughtful and make very logical, kind of consistent, nicely phrased arguments, is often terribly wrong. So I want to give a few examples. So the FOCO theories of guerrilla warfare, advocated largely by left-wing guerrillas operating in South America in the 1990s, turned out to be terribly misguided. Right? So this was the idea that was established by the generation of people who followed on, who were looking at the experience of Castro and Che Guevara and saying, okay, what you need to do is start a really low-key insurrection in the hinterlands where no one will really notice what you're doing, and run it there for a few years and build a base and then emerge on the scene and shock everyone. And this worked once in Cuba, and everywhere else it got the people who started it killed. There was a similar proposal, this thing called the action-reaction cycle, that was proposed by leftists in Europe in the 1970s. And the idea here, espoused by the Red Brigades and some parts of Baader-Meinhof and the Irish Republican Army, was, look, what you need to do is you need to provoke the government into reaction that will reveal its true nature to the people, and then a revolution will erupt. And this is an idea that comes out of actually the early Russian revolutionaries writing in 1898 to 1905. This turned out to be wrong, right? It didn't work that way. People actually had a fairly high degree of tolerance for oppressive behavior by a government quashing terrorism. We can think the same thing about the kind of lighter, faster combination of precision sensing and air power that drove the revolution in military affairs within the U.S. military, and that drove a lot of how the invasion of Iraq was planned and proposed by Secretary Rumsfeld and implemented by General Franks in 2003, and then following the invasion, the post-invasion strategy. The way that invasion was conducted looked great from the perspective of doing the invasion, but was a disaster in terms of the long-term consequences. And the way in which the invasion was done, bypassing concentrations of Iraqi forces, leaving arms dumps unsecured, led in many ways directly to the long-term security problem. So again, this military strategy that on its own grounds seemed sensible was in fact just deeply wrong. And so what I'd like to suggest is that while I agree with Michael's policy prescriptions completely, I think we should look for a logic to support them that is based on our own assessment of the situation, not on the assumption that Al-Qaeda's strategy in this case is somehow right. And I'll end there.
Okay. All right. Thank you. I think it's kind of interesting that we all came at this from very different perspectives and came out with essentially the same policy prescription. I'd like to invite questions and comments. Please come down to the mics. In general, we prefer to have students speak first, or question first. We can't possibly have answered every single one of your questions having to do with the Yemen revolution and Al-Qaeda. Yes, sir.
Can I just speak loudly instead of trying to make my way around the mic?
Are we recording this? Do we need? Yes. Okay. Sorry, Rashad, you're going to have to come down.
If you're going to say something really smart, say it up there away, and then...
Yeah. Rashad would never do that.
Well, thank you all for speaking to us. Professor Shapiro, I wanted to ask you a question about something that you mentioned early on in your talk about the significance of ungoverned spaces. And you said that ungoverned spaces aren't necessarily beneficial for these sort of armed groups, but sort of complicit or complacent governments. Could you elaborate a little bit more on that? Because you give us one comparative study. You look at Pakistan, but I mean, could we see a couple of other examples? Because I think of some parts of Africa, I think of parts of Afghanistan, I think of other places that's maybe different. So could you just elaborate, please?
Sure. So I think the most salient example here is Somalia, which despite many people's concerns over many years that this would be a wonderful place for terrorists to operate, apparently was not in the 1990s, and the record of successful plots anywhere outside of Mogadishu originating from Somalia is fairly low. And the number of people of great interest to the United States whose cars have been blown up by planes or drones operating over Somali airspace is fairly high. And so in the sense that the space is ungoverned is a problem to answer the question because in ungoverned spaces, lots of information is for sale. And the United States doesn't respect the airspace, to be fairly blunt about it. So we can think of similar things in, say, Afghanistan in 2001 on, and similarly in Afghanistan, were the U.S. ever to leave. I don't think you would ever again have a United States president, at least not in the next 50 years, who will get intelligence reports about a terrorist training camp in Afghanistan and not send in bombers, no matter what happens with Afghan sovereignty.
I think it's in the case of Yemen, I'd also like to add that despite the fact that popular reports describe large elements of Yemen as ungoverned, they're not. They're not at all equivalent to Somalia, or I would say even the northwest tribal areas of Pakistan. Al-Qaeda also has some natural limits on the degree of appeal in Yemen, both in the north and the south. Al-Qaeda is essentially a Sunni Salafi movement, extreme Sunni Salafi movement. And while it has offered support to the Southern secessionists and the Southern movement, interestingly, no Southern movement leader has picked up the offer. There's been a deafening silence from the Southerners, who, it's always dangerous to make too broad a generalization, but tend to be less Salafi. I'm not going to say secular because I think that's the wrong word in these countries. But one of the things that the Southerners do not like is the fundamentalism coming from even the mainstream Yemeni South. And so Al-Qaeda is not going to be terribly attractive to them. In terms of the northern tribes, as a start, most of them are Zaidi, which is a version of Shia, which to an Al-Qaeda is blasphemous. And so there's not a natural link there. If I'm going to use, some Mao theories of people war, this is not water in which this fish will do very well. And so they lack a Taliban to support them. They are not natural allies with northern tribes. They're not natural allies with southern secessionists. and there is no Pakistani ISI. So this is a group that in many ways is very isolated compared to its ability to operate in some other countries. Yes, ma'am.
Thank you for your talk. I will throw this to all three of you and let you duke it out over who the best person is to answer it. But each one of you touched on the idea that the U.S. is used to attacking Al-Qaeda, and that is where we are, but that's not necessarily what we need to be doing. So I was wondering what your recommendations are for what the U.S. should do to address the problems of chaotic spaces, etc.
Well, I think all three of us would probably have something to say, so we'll do Mike and then the professor, and then I'll wrap it up.
Okay. First of all, let me say that in my little longer than I was supposed to, but still very short speech, I didn't want to give the impression that I think Al-Qaeda has a good strategy. I think it's numbskull in a number of ways. But I've just harkened back to, and I'll come back to the most recent question. I remember in the Wayback Machine, I remember talking to an Israeli ace, a pilot, and it was after a series of air wars that basically Syria had gotten a bunch of new MiGs, and they were flying them, and this was going to be the thing that was making a difference in the balance in the air. And the Israelis, it was like 26 to zip. That the Israelis shot down these planes for a variety of reasons. But I remember talking to this ace at a cocktail party, and he said, well, you know, there are also Russians flying those MiG, I think they were 24s at that time. There are also Russians, and I much preferred, his guy was an ace, I much preferred fighting the Russian because the Russian flew the book, and we read the book. And the problem with the Syrian pilot is he flies the damn plane. And it was much more difficult, and it was harder to judge how we were going to do it. We had to use more this, that, and the other thing, which I won't go into. But that's what I'm trying to say about the strategy. It's not that the strategy is right, but I think at least, and it's not that it should be the only logic that we have, but I think it's important to know what they're thinking as far as we can tell in that subject, so that we don't simply fall into their little forks that they like to present us with. The problem I have in the United States is that let's say that we can stand here and talk about how the tribes don't like Al-Qaeda, but if they get some bombs that actually get through with, and it goes off in a Chicago synagogue, I think it's going to be very hard for anybody not to go into Yemen in some way. And what I'm trying to do is that's what they want us to do. That's what it's all about. That doesn't speak to ungoverned spaces. It doesn't speak to any of that, but it does speak to what they're trying to accomplish. And, you know, I can tell you I'll just read it, what they looked at. And they did all these countries, and they thought Somalia was not a priority. Egypt was not a priority because it didn't have the requirements that they wanted. They were looking for, before they knew how good we were at air power, they wanted to have geographic depth, terrain conducive to guerrilla operations, ideally mountains, distance from centers of power, weakness of the central government, especially its ability to control the peripheries of the country, its borders, and in some internal regions with high-density populations. And this is what they think. The presence of jihadists and strong Salafist preachers, although those Salafist preachers many times are the most powerful weapon against Al-Qaeda because they're not the same. But that's not ever brought out in the American press either. You know, they're very different. Salafism and Al-Qaedism is very different. A tough population, primarily Muslims without a strong national cohesion, and a wide distribution of weapons among the people and ability to use them, which I guess would make the United States ideal in that regard.
Texas.
Almost every
So
area.
Texas is a good home for...
Well, I live in Virginia, so we have a lot of guns in Virginia. But we passed a strong law. You can only buy one new gun a month in Virginia per person. So not to worry about it. So there's a lot of guns here, too. Sorry, I don't know if that answered the question. But the point is to try to think through what they're trying to do. And if they think that an ungoverned space is the space that's ideal for them, they may be wrong. It would be nice to know if they're going to, be consistently acting in that regard. It's also nice to let other Muslims know what they're thinking, other local people, because I assure you, nobody reads these books except for the bad guys, and they do. And the tapes that they make, they take it from the book. Like the Azawahiri's recent thing about Egypt, he wrote a 512-page book 59 days before the events in Egypt, and it had all that stuff. 512 pages, and he didn't even have enough imagination to name it a different name for one he wrote in 2001. It was the same exact thing, Nights Under the... which would only discourage you from reading it if you're not discouraged enough for 512 pages of Arabic. But then when he speaks, it's just the same stuff, and it's sadly out of sync.
So my take is, the question was kind of what should the United States government do in Yemen? And I'm very influenced on this score by a series of conversations I had with DFID, the UK Ministry for Foreign and International Development, about a year and a half ago. And they were interested in seeing about evaluating some programs in Yemen. And what they were very concerned with was actually the natural resource issue, and specifically water, and even more specifically, the management of runoff. And what their claim, and I don't know if this is true, but their claim was that if you just built cheap check dams, basically in all the kind of key places, in all the tertiary valleys in the mountains, so that basically when there's a big rainfall, it fills up behind a series of small dams instead of rushing all down to the sea at once, and then it's time to get into the aquifer. But this would have huge effects on the long-term security of Yemen, because water tables throughout the country are dropping very quickly. And the last thing I heard was that Sana'a was basically going to be kind of out of water in a couple of years. Now that we don't have a great understanding of a super understanding, I think, of the hydrology there, but if we're thinking about kind of long-term threats to the security and stability of that part of the world, having 25 million people who can no longer kind of manage their narcotics habit and grow enough food to kind of feed themselves and make money in a primarily agricultural economy, that seems like a serious problem, regardless of whether or not we're worried about Al-Qaeda.
I mean, I would echo that we need to look at the threats to Yemen almost irrespective of Al-Qaeda. If Al-Qaeda were to somehow disappear tomorrow, the fundamental threats to Yemen's stability and survival would remain. And I think that's, by the way, one of the reasons that the opposition in these demonstrations has been very careful not to try to seize power immediately, because they know that they can't solve the problems any better than the current government. What can we do? AQAP is there, and it is an issue, and we're not discounting that. What we should not do, as I think we've all said, U.S. boots on the ground will inflame and exacerbate the problems in ways that we will not be able to manage. Drones are not a suitable alternative. If a bomb going off in a synagogue in Chicago would drive us to action, drones going off in Yemen will drive them to action. It is exactly the same phenomena. Drones are not simple alternatives. In order to be the slightest bit effective, you need tremendous on-the-ground human intelligence resources. And so in a sense, you're right back at actually having a very large presence. And in Pakistan, it has taken us 10 years to develop the level of human intelligence to have those drones to be as effective as people claim they are. I have a personal problem with drones writ large, but we're not up to being able to use drones. We're also trying to get at about 150, 200, 300 people in a country of 23 million. Using a drone is using a sledgehammer. And when we have used them in the past, we have invariably hit the wrong people. And so you step it back one, and in this sense, I basically support what the administration has been doing, which is trying to raise Yemen's own capacity to deal with it. They are going to know where these people are and be able to track them down far better than we ever will be able to. So we have to do this through the Yemenis. It is not a slower, more inefficient way to do it. It is actually a better way to do it than ourselves. But I absolutely agree that that we need, as I said in my remarks, we need to be dealing with Yemen on its fundamental problems. And those include resource problems. They have the lack of water. Sana'a has the potential to be the first environmentally failed city in modern history. A very dubious distinction. They have inadequate energy. They have far too many people. They have inadequate education, inadequate health. These are the things that are corroding the states, and this is where we should be putting our efforts. Right now, as we've talked about, Al-Qaeda is relatively isolated in Yemen, and the best way to further that is to work on helping the rest of the Yemeni state. To the extent that we only focus on Al-Qaeda and we only focus on military, we have this very security-centric. The Yemeni people basically are going, you know, we're not here, this is a proxy war. So we need to basically turn it around. Yes, sir.
Good evening. My question is, I'm sure you all saw on the cover of the New York Times, I think it was last week, they had an article about Al-Qaeda watching history fly by, and that they're essentially that we're at a crossroads now, and the suggestion of the article is that now that Arabs have found a peaceful alternative to terrorism, not that all of them were predisposed to terrorism to begin with, but that now there is this clear road, another option, democracy, liberalism and whatnot, that this may be the death knell for Al-Qaeda recruitment, and that their ideology, the radical ideology, may not have the same sort of purchase as it used to, now that there is a challenging counter-ideology and very strong, overwhelming counter-narrative. And there's also been some reports now that Arabs have been providing more intelligence to security in the countries where revolutions have taken place about Al-Qaeda, to out them, to get rid of them essentially. So that's part of the question. And the last question, bringing it back to Yemen, is with that, I think it was just this week, there was a report of 4 Yemeni protesters being killed, and so far they're saying that it can be traced back to Al-Qaeda in Yemen. So the question then is, from a strategic point of view, how is Al-Qaeda, who's probably very aware of these dynamics, going to deal with this? Are they going to sit back and watch history fly by? Are they flexible enough to shift their tactics? What should we expect from them in the coming days, months, years? Thank you.
I mean, so what I can say about how this is likely to affect recruiting, it really draws on a previous historical era that I've looked more closely at, which is the wave of kind of anarchist and socialist terrorism that happened between about 1878 was kind of the start of it, and World War I was basically the end of it. And if you look at kind of the roster of heads of state killed by anarchists, right? It's a mess. Right? I mean, it's we're for sure above 50 and possibly above 100. Not if we're talking about senior government ministers and up, killed during that period by people who were operating in ways that they decided individually was kind of following this larger ideological trend, and that disappeared basically once it was clear that that was not going to yield anything useful. And my suspicion is that you'll have something similar where this will take a long time to tail off, but if 1 or 2 of these revolutions end up being successful, leading to kind of nice outcomes in a sense that everyone can agree on, I would suspect that that'll play a big role in this problem tailing off significantly over the next 10, 15 years, just as that previous wave of ideological terrorism did.
Yeah, I mean, I basically agree with what was in the New York Times article and what you just said. I would caution people, however, not to declare victory quite yet. And certainly there was some discussion within the government when the New York Times article came out as to whether or not our government should be in fact, publicly endorsing this idea that Al-Qaeda has become irrelevant. And the advice that was given from a number of quarters was that we should not be seen to be gloating because it would be seen to be goading. And you know, you don't want to put them in a position where they feel they have to demonstrate that, you know, they're still relevant. I would certainly hope that the demonstrations and protests, that there is enough success in enough countries, and it will be a mixed bag. Some will be more successful than others. Will discredit Al-Qaeda. But, you know, to borrow one of the more famous lines from Zhou Enlai, when asked about the French Revolution, you know, it's a little too early to tell.
If I could just
Yes, you may.
One of the Washington Post, I think today or yesterday, had articles. One on one hand, it was the same as the New York Times, and on the other hand, it had was Michael Scheuer, who tends to be somewhat
hysterical.
But I didn't agree with everything Michael Scheuer said. It's hard to, because he doesn't want you to. But the fact is, he did have some points. The point I would make is that it is way too early to tell, because you know, because it's news cycles, you know, we paced over all these different revolutions or upheavals, kind of the same, as though it's the same thing. And each one, when you start looking at it, it was completely different.
Yeah.
You know, different motivations from a different culture, from really different people. It's not the same thing at all. So I think it makes a big difference of what goes on. I think that Professor Shapiro's really good point about the color revolutions is that if I were sitting in a cave, and it was a very nice cave, I would stay there for a while, because I would think, you know, it's going to take a while before the glow wears off. And then if they let enough people out of prisons, and there's enough people who've been tortured and warped by various administrations, we can move back in, and we'll do something then. So I think it's a little too early to tell. I think that I agree with Barbara, though, that I don't think we should be gloating. But I also think that the United States should not be talking about Al-Qaeda at all, because I think the more we talk about them, the more we make them important. Yeah. And I think what we should be talking about is our traditional values. What happened to that? You know, the things that we found out is that they wring their hands in print about how people like us, and how wrong that is, because we don't support human rights. We are really very warlike. We are not really very good in our own country. I mean, you know, the book that I told you about has all these statistics between people of color and white men, and, you know, different rates of diseases and how badly we treat everybody in our own country. So we don't stand for anything. I think we should try our best, as hard as it is, to stand for what we're supposed to stand for, not talk about Al-Qaeda, and not just knee-jerk reaction. And the more light and facts we can shed about the Middle East, the differences between people, how Islam is not the problem, how even very fundamentalist Muslims are not the problem. In fact, they're the solution in a lot of cases. That would be the way I would go, and that's the hardest way to go of all, because it involves knowledge. It involves people coming to places like this and getting much better speakers than me to tell them about some of this stuff.
As the man said, come on down.
Okay. I'm wondering if we could back up a little here on Yemen, and give us a little bit more depth here. Why is Yemen a country?
Oh.
That is, what is pulling it together as a country, and what centrifugal elements are we fighting in trying to do that, and what would be the best way to pull it together as a stronger country?
Okay, I will take that one. I have the dubious distinction of having worked on Yemen longer than Ali Abdullah Saleh has been president, which was occasionally a useful talking point when I was meeting with him. Yemen is a real country, unlike some other countries in the world. You can go way back in history, and there has been a Yemen. One of the things, borders may be artificial, but the country and the society and the identity is very real. There is a very strong Yemeni identity. There are regional differences, absolutely. And if you're from the Hadramaut, you're very proud of that, and if you're in Adeney, you're proud of that. They have regional differences, they have regional distinctions, they have regional pride, and they have some regional grievances that are very real. But one of the things that strikes almost anybody who works in Yemen or works with Yemenis is that there is the major centripetal force is identity and a sense of shared history. It was interesting, they were not actually reunified in 1990, they were unified. The last time I think all of this territory was actually one country was several hundred years ago. But it was actually more of a natural unification than perhaps the German unification at almost the same time. They do not suffer from the sectarian differences that you see in Iraq. They do not suffer from the ethnic differences that you have in Afghanistan. There are different political histories between different regions, and this is very Yemeni. North and South Yemen were actually east and west of each other, which kind of, there's a certain contrariness to them that you have to learn how to deal with. But North Yemen, South Yemen, and the Hadramaut, which is that huge area that goes off to the east, have three very different political histories. And in that sense, the unification was it was one that was emotionally very strongly felt, but putting the three different political structures together has proved to be very different. There is a sense, and I think their biggest problem, to kind of come back to some of the issues we've talked about, is this lack of resources and lack of revenues. It is one of the 20 poorest countries in the world, sitting on a peninsula with some of the wealthiest countries in the world. And one of the issues that this government and any subsequent government is going to have to deal with is that every region feels that it's not getting its fair share of resources. The Houthi rebellion was, we are marginalized, we are discriminated against, we're not getting government services. The Southerners make the same claim. There was a Washington Post article about the demonstrations in Taiz, which is actually probably one of the agriculturally wealthiest part of an otherwise very poor country. And one of their complaints was that they're being discriminated against, marginalized, and not getting their services. And to a certain extent, you have everyone in the country feeling they're not getting their piece of the pie. And there's not really a recognition that it's not a pie, it's a Pop-Tart. There just aren't the resources to go around. And so you have an identity, there is a very fundamental commitment to unity, despite secessionist talk in the South. It's almost an article of faith, the unity. There's an article of faith that it is some kind of Republican government. The Houthi idea to bring back the imam, the theocracy, got no traction whatsoever. It's a country that continues to try to make a success of itself while it still understands its enormous problems. Its biggest problem is its population. Its population to resources. But it is more of a real country and has more of a sense of being a real country than an awful lot of other countries that we talk about. Afghanistan, Iraq, and even Iraq I always thought had a stronger identity than the Bush administration gave it credit for. But this is a country that has a very strong sense of being a Yemen. What they haven't fully decided is what that means in terms of government and governance. Yes, sir.
I have a question, two questions. You indicated that Al-Qaeda was isolated in terms. Could you give us, is that isolation in terms of geographical location where they established themselves, or are they isolated because of the way they're spread out in various communities? The second question, which I think is more important, you've talked about we can't have boots on the ground, and yet we know we have drones and to some extent some special ops. But the problem is, you say, is that they have to take over and make the security situation their own. I've heard you speak in the past. It really is a state that has no economic base to any extent. How do you see them having the capacity to address this question militarily? And do they have an officer corps that's been adequately trained, either in the U.S., as in the circumstances that we've seen in other countries, or is the officer corps something more along the lines of patronage, that this is how it occurs? And the last question is, because the majority of the population is under the age of 15, does that mean that at a certain, when you get over 15, you leave? And so is there an issue of remittances that somehow stabilizes the economic situation?
I'll invite you to be in my seminar, my 12-week seminar on Yemen, see if I can get through all of those questions. Al-Qaeda it's isolated, as I said. There is not a government that supports it, as you had with the Taliban. It has some basic disconnects of its narrative with either the Zaydis in the north or the Southerners in the south. It is relatively small, and I think we do need to talk about another part of AQAP, which is the internet version, where we've been talking about almost a very conventional AQAP. We have used some drones, but I think, as you noticed, I don't think we've used them recently. There's an understanding that they're counterproductive. The military in Yemen is very weak, and probably the most corrupt element of the government. I've said that and still been able to get back in the country. For those who start looking for simple templates and think that, if you're going to get rid of the government, you have the military come in, as happened in Egypt, that is probably the last group that could take over in Yemen. It's not a strong officer corps. It's not a prestige profession. It's not well trained, and it doesn't have the kind of national reputation that you have in some other countries. The people that we have been working with in terms of training, equipping, advising, so that they can handle this more sufficiently themselves, has really been the Central Security Organization, working with the Border Patrol, working with the Coast Guard, and working with the CSO. And that's very unnatural to us. And when I was ambassador, the president's son, who was, I don't think, ever going to succeed his father, really. But the son was in charge of the special operations. And we had people from our special operations who wanted, president's son in charge of special operations, we need to go in and have a relationship. And trying to explain that, no, this is not really a special operations organization. The people you need to be working with are over at CSO, the Central Security. Some of the officer corps is very good and very well trained, particularly on the CSO side, but it is not a very strong military. We have been working with it now for only a few years. Interestingly, again, in comparison to, say, Egypt, Ali Abdullah Saleh did not build a militocracy. They did not dominate in the government. They do not dominate in business. They were basically kept pretty well untrained and unequipped for a very long time. In part because there really wasn't that kind of, there weren't the threats that would have supported a military. And that wasn't where he was really putting his money and his effort. It went more into CSO, and it went more into the government. Was made up almost entirely of civilians, so it's a very different dynamic. In that sense, we've been having to really build their security capacity from a fairly low level. In many cases, certainly when I was there and since then, if the army was involved in a confrontation, they almost always lost. There are any number of cases where there would be an incident and you would see, as a rough number, 50 people killed. And most people's assumption was 50 of the bad guys were killed or 50 civilians were killed. It was usually 45 military were killed. They weren't terribly effective. And to a certain extent, we have had to go find another partner, and that's been CSO. Did I get all of your questions?
Well, who's going to pay them? I mean, will they then basically be supported financially?
Yemen is going to be assistance dependent for a very long time. And I will say, one thing to add, we are not Yemen's major financial supporter. We're actually a fairly minor supporter. Even the $150 million that we talk about, and a number of the aid levels, military aid levels that we've talked about, that have been publicized in this country, haven't been approved. Because there is I think, a justified debate, although I wish it had been settled sooner, between the levels of military assistance, military/security assistance, and economic development assistance, as we've been talking about. That's been an ongoing debate for the last 2 years in our own government. In terms of economic development and that side, the Brits, the French, the Japanese, the Germans, the Dutch, the Qataris, the Emiratis, I mean, there's a whole list of people. The Saudi assistance tends to be far more direct assistance to the government and to personalities, both within the government and outside, but there's a lot of, we'll call it budget support to be diplomatic. And on the military side, we're probably the major supporter, but we're not the only supporter. And not often the main, but Yemen will be assistance dependent for a very long time. In terms of remittances, the Yemeni economy up until 1990 was almost entirely remittance based. Oil was only discovered and exploited in any kind of very minimal commercial quantities in the 80s. So it was a remittance based economy. That ended in the early 90s for a whole lot of reasons, only one of which was the Kuwait War. The Yemenis would love to be able to export their labor. They would love to be able to have arrangements with the Gulf states to have their workers there and get back to a remittance-based economy. One of the problems is that Yemeni labor tends not to have the skills that are needed even in the Gulf countries in terms of skilled labor. And so they're really not marketable and they're not organized. And their ability to operate as migrant workers in a number of other countries outside the peninsula is also severely constrained. Some of that is an education problem. It's a skills problem.
Barbara, if I could just,
yeah.
On the military, I don't think, you know, if I were advising anybody about how to get Al-Qaeda, I wouldn't say it was a military solution, even inside Yemen. You know, if you think back about when in Iraq, when basically, despite all the hoopla about the surge, what really happened in Iraq was that the people looked around and said, you know, these guys no longer serve our purposes. They're getting in the way of us getting what we want to get now, and they started disappearing. You know, and they just didn't tolerate them anymore. It's a matter of there are very few of them, so mounting huge campaigns is not going to find them necessarily. Yeah. But it's the local people, if they have some reason why they don't want to tolerate them, they'll stop tolerating them. And that's giving them something closer to economic assistance or some projects or something they can get only if they can show that, you know, they're Al-Qaeda free or something like that.
Can I just ask a quick follow-up?
Sure.
To Michael Ryan. Is there a possibility that this external workforce, the people who left Yemen because of their lack of education and skilled labor, that they become a radicalized element and become part of the Al-Qaeda problem by returning to Yemen with that ideology?
Yes, that's always a possibility, although I think that, you know, the correlation between poverty and extremism is highly debated. I think it's important to also point out that the AQAP threat we're looking at it again in fairly conventional terms. in terms of number of people being. The real threat that we have been dealing with from AQAP has been more of a virtual space threat. It's been Samir Khan, that is?
No, it was
Khan.
It was that guy who was arrested recently.
No, Khan is the one who does Inspire magazine.
Oh, I don't know.
Okay, but there's an Anwar al-Awlaki, who we all know about, and I'm pretty sure his name is Samir Khan, who is also an American-born, Pakistani-American, I believe. What they are doing is operating in virtual space in terms of recruiting through the internet. And that's it's a very real threat, it's a different kind of threat, and I agree with Michael, it's not one that's going to be dealt with militarily. It's going to have to be dealt with differently. So we have to kind of get away from the idea of large numbers of people going forth and doing things. It's a very small group. They can be very deadly, but they're actually operating in a different space than a territorial space now.
The other thing, if I could just add one other issue, is that I don't think that those people coming back, I mean, they may be a problem, but they don't automatically become Al-Qaeda people. I mean, it just doesn't work that way. The guys that are the most virulent Al-Qaeda guys, if you look at them, except for the top leader, but the second guy on down, are people who somebody had in jail, they tortured, that's the way they got radicalized. So I mean, if you want to create Al-Qaeda, what you do is you round people up and put them in jails. That's.
Okay. Any other questions? We are kind of getting towards the end. Okay, well, thank you all very much.